The time has come to reaffirm our enduring spirit, to choose our better history, to carry forward that precious gift, that noble idea passed on from generation to generation, the God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness.
Today, I am honored and delighted to be a youthful voice to help celebrate this occasion. Imagine the problems that would be solved if all people were kind and feel cared for. It doesn't matter what your race. I challenge you to let today also be a celebration of your commitment to become a more caring and kind individual to all.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. How are you? My name is Vidette Coleman Robinson, and I am the Executive Director of the Association of African American Museums. Today, I would like to thank Project 1619, the Fort Monroe Authority, the National Park Service, and the City of Hampton for the invitation to moderate the 2020 African Landing Day Town Hall today. The Town Hall's title is Lift Your Voice, 1619, and the Power of Collaboration. As we think about moving forward beyond the year 400-year commemoration and dig into this discussion, I would like to introduce Eola Dance, Acting Superintendent, as she will set the stage and provide the purpose of our discussion.
Greetings on behalf of the National Park Service. 401 years ago, a transaction took place at Old Point Comfort, where 20 and odd captive Africans were traded for victuals and forced into labor. These first documented Africans in the Virginia colony originated from Central Africa in the Ndongo Kingdom, present-day Angola, aboard the San Juan Bautista, headed to Mexico. First Africans were pirated from the Portuguese and placed aboard two English privateer ships, the White Lion and Treasurer. The White Lion is the documented ship in the historical record reported by John Rolfe in 1619. Also established in 1619 was the Virginia House of Burgesses, a governing body. However, it isn't until 1662 that inheritable race-based slavery was codified in Virginia. Fort Monroe has the unique history of being both the place of African arrival and the location of the 1861 contraband decision, which led to thousands of freedom seekers finding refuge behind Union lines, which is problematic because the rationale is rooted in the idea of freedom seekers being property. Yet, this history remains significant to the passage of the First Confiscation Act, Second Confiscation Act, recruitment of United States colored troops, and ultimately the passage of the 13th Amendment, which brought to an end legal slavery. In the spirit of Sankofa, we continue to seek understanding of this challenging and dynamic history through our collective commitment to document the past and provide opportunities to lift up untold stories moving forward. We come together to talk with you today. As you have questions, there will be a Q&A at the end of the discussion. You may place your questions in chat and we will respond to your questions. We will follow up with you if we don't have the opportunity to answer your question during the call today. My distinguished co-panelists will now introduce themselves at this time.
Good evening. I'm Calvin Pearson. I am the founder of Project 1619, and we're so delighted that you joined us today for the town hall meeting. We hope today's program will be very educational and informative, and we look forward to your questions.
Hi, I'm Cassandra Newby-Alexander. I'm a professor of history at Norfolk State University and the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. And since 2012, I have been very engaged with helping to host conferences and other programs having to do with 1619. And I was actually spurred to go in that direction by Calvin Pearson. He is the one who since 2006 has been, as far as I know, has been raising the banner for us to look at and to investigate, especially as scholars, not only what happened at Old Point Comfort, but what happened in 1619. And so I am very much delighted to be a part of this town hall.
Thank you, Cassandra. My name is Glenn Oder. I am the executive director of the Fort Monroe Authority. My background is I'm a professional landscape architect and involved in lots of land planning and rezonings and site design work. I also spent 10 years in the Virginia General Assembly as a member of the House of Delegates, and I have been at Fort Monroe for 9 years as the executive director. I also think it's interesting to introduce a little bit about Fort Monroe and just simply say that what a unique piece of property this is, because it is, in 1817, after the War of 1812, the property was given to the Army. And so the Army cocooned this property for a couple hundred years. But when they got it in 1817, it said, if you ever stop using it for military purposes, it comes back to the Commonwealth of Virginia. So part of the comments I'm going to be making today are going to be around this, that there's this unique opportunity where it's not just the panelists that are here, but it's the property itself is here as well. And this is an opportunity for us that we've never had before to explore and interpret this property now that it no longer belongs to the Army. So it's a gift, it's a challenge, and it's an opportunity all wrapped into one. And I look forward to being part of this discussion today.
Thank you, Calvin, Cassandra, Glenn, and Eola. I appreciate you guys also. Well, I have been to Fort Monroe several times, and I'm just always in awe of everything that Fort Monroe and Hampton have to offer. So I'm really excited to be able to be on this panel with you today. Our first question is, reflecting on the rich history of 1619 and the arrival of Africans to the Virginia colonies, what are some of the pieces of history, recent scholarship, and how has that revealed that most people don't know when they visit Fort Monroe?
Okay, this is Calvin, and I'll start off the discussion. And my role today is to tell you a little bit about Project 1619 and tell you what we've been doing for the past 26 years to try to educate people on the true story of the Africans. So this is going to be a brief synopsis on what we've learned. Because if you go to Fort Monroe, they have a great visitor center with a lot of this information. So we encourage you to go there. But in my brief overview, let me just state that I was born and raised here right in Hampton, Virginia. We were taught about Jamestown, Captain John Smith, Chief Powhatan, and Pocahontas. We were taught the first slaves arrived on a slave ship at Jamestown. It had been true. We thought it was true because there it was in black and white in our history books. It had to be true. It was not until I was an adult and I became more self-educated that I discovered the history of our African ancestors was a false narrative. Thanks to my associates, people like Catherine Knight and Rick Murphy and John Thornton, we put together a new narrative based on current history. And what I wanted to tell you today, I want to talk about some of the myths that we have been taught and some of us still use today. Our ancestors were not allowed to be taught, read, or write. So the history of our ancestors was written by those who owned them and by those who oppressed them. In 1994, I started a national campaign and international campaign. I talked to a lot of people in Africa to tell the true story of the Africans. I and others then created Project 1619 Incorporated. So let me talk about the myths and falsehood about the African ancestors. Our story is about the first enslaved Africans captured from Angola and brought to the Virginia colony. The Africans landed at Point Comfort, present-day Fort Monroe, and not at Jamestown. Point Comfort is located 30 nautical miles downstream from Jamestown. The ships had to stop at Point Comfort. They could not go directly to Jamestown. Only 2 of the Africans on the first ship were ever taken to Jamestown. No ship, no slave ship, no pirate ship ever traveled to Jamestown. All of the Africans were traded at Point Comfort. These were the first Africans in the English colony. And I keep saying English colony because the settlers came from England. It was King James from England. But historians want to call it a British colony. There was no UK at that time. Yes, there were Africans in Florida first, but Florida was a Spanish colony. Did not join the United States of America until 1819. The first ship that brought Africans to the Virginia colony was not a slave ship, but a pirate ship. Pirate ships attacked a Spanish ship headed for Veracruz, Mexico, and took 60 Africans. The Africans were not slaves. They were enslaved Africans. The first pirate ship that landed here carried a precious cargo of the famous or infamous 20 and odd Africans. We now know that that number was a little bit higher than 20. We know that John Ross reported their landing, and he did not want anybody to know the true number because he knew that they had been pirated from a Spanish ship and that piracy was illegal. So he tried to shroud the number of people actually on the first ship. Many people call the White Line a Dutch ship because that's part of the documentation that we've been falsely led to believe. But it was an English ship with an English captain, with an English crew. There was a treaty between England and Portugal and Spain not to pirate each other's ships on the high seas. So they went to the Netherlands to get a Dutch contract to pirate ships. Thus, they were flying a Dutch flag. For the past 100 years or so, historians have said the ship landed on August 20th, 1619. New research indicates they arrived on August 25th. No one can justify where the August 20th date came from, but it's been used for over 100 years. But that date became folklore, accepted as true date, and that's what they keep repeating. There were no Africans in the Virginia colony prior to August of 1619. The report that there were 32 Africans in the colony as early as March 1619 was false. The muster of Africans was taken in March of 1620. The first Africans were not slaves in the true antebellum description of a slave. Documentation shows that most of the 32 Africans were freed by 1650. So if you were going to be eventually freed, why do you call them a slave? Slaves were not eventually given their freedom. This project has special meaning to me because I am a direct descendant from an African woman brought in 1619. So let me close with this. African Landing Day is a commemoration. It's a day of commemoration or a day of remembrance of a dreadful chapter in our nation's history, but it is not a celebration. We do not celebrate slavery and the social injustice they had to endure. So thank you.
Thank you, Calvin. Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander.
Thank you. And thank you, Calvin, for providing a really rich understanding of some key points. And I really would like to follow up with you, or follow up with some of the things that you mentioned. I have taken a lot of time trying to present the argument that that the Africans who were brought here against their will were not enslaved. In fact, there's no documentation to actually support that argument. What we do know is that prejudice existed, but the Virginia colony, also called the Jamestown colony at that time, did not have a system of enslavement. Instead, we would see laws being passed and court cases being delivered that began to systematically, step by step, by 1639, begin to remove the rights of these Africans step by step as human beings. So their rights began to be whittled away. And what is interesting about the laws, and I would recommend very strongly that people go back and read a seminal work that was published in 1978 by A. Leon Higginbotham, and it was entitled In the Matter of Color. And he was a giant among jurists and legal scholars who looked at the history, the evolutionary history of the law as it regarded race in America from the earliest period through the end of the colonial period and even a little bit into the revolutionary period. And one of the things that he pointed out was that the law was used against people of African descent in a very deliberate and very forceful way. By 1667, we would see a law that indicated that any Black person could be casually killed by a white person if they resisted in any way. So in essence, the law removed the ability of Africans to even defend themselves against rape, against assault, and even against efforts to kill them. And if they defended themselves, they could be killed and it was not considered murder. And so we would see this evolution, and along with the evolution would be an evolution of creating a system of enslavement. Even though Massachusetts would pass a law in 1645 designating Africans as enslaved people, Virginia would take its time to actually designate them as enslaved people. And so I think it's so important for us to understand that. But the other thing that's so important is to understand that for so long there have been historical silences regarding the very humanity of the people who were brought here against their will. And that is the thing that historians are looking at now. And I know that Linda Haywood and John Thornton are two historians among many who have been making efforts to go back to a lot of the original documents and to take upon themselves efforts to find the clues so they can begin to trace the origins of many of these individuals in America and to find their descendants. And Calvin mentioned Rick Murphy, and of course the national organization, the Black Genealogists, is the National African American Genealogical Association, has made a lot of efforts to begin to reconnect people with their past. And what, of course, they're finding out is that many of these early Africans, in some cases, actually disappeared into white society or disappeared into Native society. Many, of course, continued to claim their heritage from Africa. And so there's a lot of research that's going on now, more so than ever before. But I want to end my really introductory part by reading you something very quickly that Leon Higginbotham wrote in his book, 1978, and I think it resonates today. He says, Today, meaning 1978, but it could have been written in 2020, he said, America is finally at the point where it has the potential to resolve in a positive way so many of the problems of the past. If we dare ignore this opportunity, the alternative will be to drift into further polarization. The ultimate direction in which this nation moves may well depend on how it interprets its legacy, both as Black citizens and to its white citizens, centuries of slavery assured and guaranteed by the law. And I would say that what is happening right now at Fort Monroe and the visitor center and what they're trying to do is to make sure that from this point moving forward, we would begin to start understanding, embracing, and learning more about this important history and this legacy that's part of our American nation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Glenn, I think you're next.
Yeah, thank you, Vedette. I think rather than focus primarily on history, I want to tell you about some recent things that have happened at Fort Monroe that will begin to describe to us the impact and the power of place that Point Comfort at Fort Monroe has. And I think what I'm trying to describe is we actually can feel history here. Really good example is we had a group of people brought in an actor who was telling us about the Tuskegee Airmen, and he was very engaged in the Tuskegee Airmen, and he portrayed the Tuskegee Airmen. When he was speaking in our theater. We have a 600-seat theater. He got done with his performance. I went up to him and I said, "You don't know where you are, do you?" And he said, "Well, I'm somewhere in Hampton." And I said, "Let me tell you about Fort Monroe." And I put him in my car and I drove him around the property. And as I told him about the history of Fort Monroe, which has already been told to you today, he said, "Stop the car." And before I could stop, he had opened up the door and he ran over to the wall of the fortress and put his hands on the wall. You know, I thought he was sick or tired of hearing me talk. And I ran over to him and I said, "Are you all right?" He said, I had to touch this wall." We had a national artist that came to Fort Monroe with his wife and was wanting to learn more about this history and the history of his culture. And we were driving through the property and we drove through the main gate. And he said, "Is that the main gate that you told me about?" And I said, "Yes, but we're really behind schedule." And he said, "No." I said, "I want to stop the bus." I said, "Well, we're really behind schedule." He said, "I said stop the bus." And I said, "Bus driver, that's the second time I've told you to stop the bus." So the bus driver stopped the bus and we got out and we walked back there and he stood in front of the main gate and he and his wife had their picture taken. He held her hand and then he walked through the main gate. And as he did, he drug his fingers along the granite walls. And I thought to myself as I watched him do this, I thought, he is passing through the exact same veil that Baker, Townsend, and Mallory, the three contrabands, passed through that when they were no longer considered property. And what's really fascinating about this is that at the time both this occurred, I wasn't aware of it. There were others that were, but we were just beginning to realize this, that when the fortress was built, the National Park Service and others discovered a ledger. And with any great construction project, somebody's got to take notes. You know, how many horses were rented that day? How many bricks were made? How much hay was bought? The ledger includes the names of the enslaved from the community who were hired by contractors to be the masons to build Fort Monroe. And so the walls that these two experiences that I told you about meant so much to these men, I get it now. I get it. There's power of place right here at Fort Monroe. And if you haven't been here, I hope that you will come here and learn more about Fort Monroe. Thank you, Vedette.
Thanks, Glenn. Eola.
That's the perfect segue in thinking about the scholarship and the tangible, and in establishing a national monument and thinking about planning and interpretation and telling stories for a new park. We actually started out with a scholars roundtable asking that question of the arc of slavery, thinking about arrival in 1619 through emancipation in 1865, and the significance of Fort Monroe in telling that story. When I think about the research or a myth or the questions, I think Calvin spoke to it earlier, and it's this whole discussion over indentured or enslaved. I'm not only a preservationist and park ranger, but I'm also a graduate student. And so this is also the subject of my doctoral research. And when I first embarked on that, effort, I thought, oh man, this has been argued for hundreds of years, as Cassandra mentioned. And everyone settled on this idea of indentured or enslaved from the beginning. But if you've been following the conversation over the past 2 years, you'll see that it's still very much so contested. And so for me, the research that we did between 2011 and 2015, and the work of the scholars that had been mentioned, in addition to Thornton and Haywood, I'd also mention Michael Glasgow, James Sweet, Michael Gomez, and their work that helps us to understand that for over 130 years prior to the White Lion and the treasurer attacking the San Juan de Batista, the Portuguese had been trafficking Africans from Central Africa to the Caribbean, to Central America. And so that is established. That is not something that's unknown or new. It was something that the English did not have the monopoly on at this early time period, but eventually gained the monopoly on. As tobacco became the cash crop and the drive for slave labor increased, the English became more involved in the slave trade. And so this early period is really interesting to me, particularly 1619 to 1662. And I was intrigued when I read the work of Ibram Kendi X, and he referred to one of the early planters in Jamestown, including in his will, that his chattel Negro servant would be inherited by his descendants. This is far before 1662. And so that language exists in the understanding of these early English settlers. Though at that time, slavery was considered illegal. In English common law, there had already been an understanding of what the difference was between slavery, indentured servitude, and what it meant to be a free man. So I find it incredible thinking about the scholarship and then thinking about being on this landscape and exploring that history, understanding that first Africans in Virginia arrived right here.
Thank you, Eola. You guys have me having all the feels, and I'm like, I wish COVID were not here so that we could be in person and just walk the grounds. But COVID's here, and we're doing it virtually, and we can have you guys send us some soil or something. Just make sure it goes under a UV light first. But thank you, Eola, for that. I feel like I want to be in your class when you actually start doing all of this and start teaching. And I know that might not be in your cards, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you that it is. So the next question is, African Landing Day is an opportunity to honor and remember those who survived the terror of war, trauma of Middle Passage, and weight of bondage. Though we can celebrate African American perseverance and contributions to society through all of those terrors. What is the distinction in remembrance? And what about 1619 is so important to this moment in history? And meaning, why is it so important today? in today's history. So Glenn, I'm going to let you kick it off since you already have your mic off.
I think I was next on the list, so that's why
you were, but you weren't supposed to reveal the magic behind the curtain. It's okay.
So sorry. Hey, I just want to say, this is there's a moment in time that we are all experiencing right now. We often talk about shifting landscapes or shifting sands that take place, and we're going through this. There have been a series of things which occurred in recent history, in our lifetime, very recently. The Army suddenly decided that, you know what, we don't fight wars with stone forts anymore. We don't need cannons on the Chesapeake Bay to defend the Chesapeake Bay anymore. Oh, and by the way, in 1817, some clever legislator said, I'll tell you what, if we ever stop using this for coastal defenses, you better give it back to us, Army. You know what the Army said? Wow, we don't really need this property anymore. 565 acres of land, 2 million square feet of buildings, and 1 water meter for the entire property. It's a very complicated piece of property. And the Army said, we're going to use that reversionary clause, Commonwealth, and we're going to give you your property back just like in 1817 that you said that you did. And so the Commonwealth of Virginia had no choice in the matter. The Commonwealth of Virginia simply received the property back into itself. The Commonwealth recognized that this was really significant, and citizens, I want to say it was really citizens that pushed political leaders to realize the significance of the story. Groups like Project 1619, it was undeniable the significance of this property. And so the answer to that was to give it a national flag. And the national flag, National Park Service. So the National Park Service came to Fort Monroe, but they weren't interested in all 565 acres or all 2 million square feet of buildings. So they created an arrangement where they took some really significant historical aspects of the property, and a partnership was formed with the Commonwealth of Virginia, which created the Fort Monroe Authority to create this partnership. And then other partnerships were created with Project 1619 and the City of Hampton and others. But the point is that all of this has come together to where we now control the property. I dare to guess how much access we would have to this property today in the light of the George Floyd earthquake that took place. Imagine if the Army still owned this property. I don't imagine the Army would be letting us have 600 people from Black Lives Matter come and gather because they want to be on this property where this power of place is and hold a peaceful rally. I don't believe that there would be a $9 million visitor center like has just been built at Fort Monroe that is now telling the stories of not just the first Africans that were here, but also the Indians. The Army never talked about the Indians that were here before that. So what I want to stress to everybody is, as we think about this moment in history, is there is a divine timing that is associated with this. And to me, it's almost as once we controlled the property, or the people controlled the property as opposed to the Army, to me, I'll close with this, it's almost like the earth shifted. Here in coastal Virginia, we see the tides come and fall. Every now and then you get a really high tide, every now and then you get a really low tide. It's almost like we got a super low tide right now in a landscape which we've never seen before has suddenly become visible. And there's artifacts and information and history that has suddenly become alive to us that we've never seen or talked about before. So this is a divine moment in history, and I think everybody, like in the Bible, story of Ruth, for such a time as this, we're all here now, and future generations are going to say, what did they do for the 400-year anniversary? What did they do for the 401st year? And we're making history right now, and so it's exciting to see so much interest in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Cassandra, you are next.
Thank you. And I very much appreciate what Glenn was saying. And, the issue that we have at Fort Monroe, and the reason I believe that space, that landscape is so important is because it represents something for America. And many historians are doing this, and that is they are rewriting our master narrative. America has a narrative that says that, You know, people came from England and they created everything, and they expanded across the country and built this nation and created these ideals of aspiration that drew the world to America, and it created a melting pot, and everybody became a happy part of this nation, a nation of opportunities. And so we are celebrating what no one else has done. This is American exceptionalism. That's our master narrative. But the real narrative of America bears very little resemblance to that master narrative. And there have been efforts for so many decades to try to shift the narrative so that we can bring perspective, we can bring truth, we can bring facts, we can bring a better understanding of who we are as a people. But of course, we have folks who then see this as a challenge to them personally, because unfortunately in America, and for too many white Americans, when you talk about race, you talk about racism, it's a personal thing. It's as if people have to see it as, well, I'm not prejudiced, I'm not a racist, so racism doesn't exist. But 400 years ago, with the forced arrival of Africans, we began to see the emerging racialized system. That racism became embedded in every aspect of American society. It became a part of our landscape, indelibly ingrained even into how we viewed ourselves. But historians over the past 20 years have begun to shift that master narrative and say, no, this is not who America is or what America is or who Americans are. We're very diverse. We're not a homogeneous society. We're a heterogeneous society, and people didn't expand across the nation, not unless you're expanding on someone's face. You conquered this nation. You violently took land from people and you kill people in the process. That doesn't take away from the great achievements of people who are Americans, but certainly by ignoring that part of our history, we take away something very important, and that is our understanding of who we have been, and in some cases, who we are right now. And so I think that what is happening at Fort Monroe with the commemoration of 1619, it is a new beginning. You know, historians and sociologists say it takes about 20 years before you get into the new century. And here we are in 2020, and there are a lot of things happening in 2020, including the pandemic, but also including another social revolution. And we've seen many social revolutions in this country. I keep hearing people with the hyperbole about, oh, this is the most controversial period in American history. And I'm thinking, didn't we have a civil war back starting in 1861? Didn't we have an American Revolution that started in 1775? I have to kind of, settle myself down when I hear all the hyperbole, because people don't understand history, and history is only for the moment, what I remember or where I am today. But what's happening at Fort Monroe, I believe, is a new beginning, or it can be a new beginning for our nation, when we finally begin to turn our attention to the founding principles of our country, which was based on inequality, which was based on racism, because it wasn't until 1619 that there was any assurance that the colony would actually continue and survive. And so even though 1607 was the founding year of the Jamestown settlement, it really was 1619 that was the founding year of America. And who were we in 1619, and let's come to grips with that and then move that forward to where can we go. And that remembrance is not a celebratory remembrance of, oh, look at all the great things we did, but it is a remembrance of who we were at that time, our journey up to that point, and who we are now, and including all of the things, the good, the bad, and the ugly, that was a part of our society, and the people who were brought here, the people who came here willingly, the people who were already here, and what was their life like, what were their contributions, what was their society, and what did they bring to the table to create what we call the United States of America.
Thank you, Dr. Newby-Alexander. You can't see them, but I saw a lot of head nods and claps and church fans waving and all types of things going on. But thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, the hyperbole is what's the problem right now, and it's very problematic. And I am just going to say this. I know nobody really wants me to, but thank you for your service at Norfolk State University. I'm an alumna of Virginia State, so I am always going to shout out our HBCUs when I know that people are on the panel doing the great things. Okay, Eola, another HBCU graduate.
Yes, yes. And my goodness, just thinking about what Glenn and Cassandra have shared so far, I'm just over here. I'm one of those people who is, feeling like we were preaching or something. But in terms of remembrance, the Atlantic slavery was a disruption in the lives of Africans. And that arrival in a foreign land is a source of trauma. And so in the history field now, we are thinking quite a bit about trauma studies and how that's related to historiography and the work that we do. And so when you think, about the modern civil rights movement, Jim Crow era, these traumas are compounded. And so, to consider what we're experiencing right now, what we're witnessing, for those who are protesting, for those who are calling for peace rallies, all of these things. This is about healing. I noticed that in the comments, someone said healing is possible. And that's been a big question that I've asked. And I've asked, what is the role of the museum when it comes to being a space and a place where we can have dialogue, where we can, consider research, where we can heal within communities and across communities. And so some of that work is begun at Colonial National Historical Park, which is our sister park, which is the location of Jamestown settlement. You can visit historic Jamestown. We have a shared interest in this narrative. And there are other working groups. I think some of my colleagues actually with the Angela Project are on the line now. So I'll say hi to Dwayne Scheid and Sharday Reed. This work is about providing a space for people to tell their stories, to engage descendants, to engage community partners, and to think about how we can tell these stories together.
Thank you, Eola. Calvin, you are next.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed all those comments. So what I want to talk about is remembrance and the importance of 1619. So what we do at Fort Monroe is that we do a libation to honor and commemorate those first Africans. We do a flower petal ceremony to honor the millions of lives lost. You heard the phrase, we must remember, but we must never forget. We must never forget that our ancestors were captured from their homeland. Many of them were princesses and princesses. We must never forget that they were stripped of their clothing. They were branded with a hot iron. They were loaded into a slave ship. Africans all around them were dying. Those dead Africans were thrown overboard into the ocean where they'd be eaten by sharks. We call ourselves a land of immigrants, but when we think about it, Africans, the only ethnic group in America brought here in chains and against their wills. That's why we must always remember our history. African landing is one of the most significant events in America's history. It is the birth of Africa in English North America. Cassandra earlier called it what we're going through now is a new beginning, and I call it a new birth. 40th anniversary of a new birth. It was a renewing of the spirit of our ancestors. Fort Monroe is the starting point of bondage in English North America. It started in an era that would last for 246 years until slavery was abolished in 1865. I call their landing an accidental landing because they were not intended to be brought here. If those pirate ships had not attacked a slave ship, the destiny of the Virginia colony and what would become the United States would have drastically changed. Who knows if or when Africans would ever have been brought to the Virginia colony or the North American continent. The Virginia colony had no intention of importing Africans. That's why I call it the accidental landing. We must remember the settlers were dying and were prepared to pack up and go back to England when Africans became their golden age. Their free labor saved the Virginia colony. Those Africans brought the skills the colony needed in agriculture, agronomy, raising farm animals, soul food, religion, drumming, dance, basket weaving, woven textiles. The slavery also had an impact on Africa. We can't forget that impact. 30 million Africans were captured and millions died in the battle. Many millions died sailing through the Middle Passage. So when we look at 1619, we must remember the torturous journey of those ancestors and the impact it had on Africa. These were enduring acts that are still impacting Africa and America today. So that's why it's so important that we remember where our ancestors come from, and we remember what has happened for the past 401 years. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Calvin. Our next question is, when thinking about African origins, descendant communities, everyday visitors and scholars who explore the sites and history at Fort Monroe, how has your work as an individual, organizational, and in collaboration helped to expand our understanding of African landing? And Eola, you are up next.
Well, as you all have heard, you have a national monument here at Fort Monroe. And so just by nature of that designation, what we're saying is that the history and significance of this place, the people, the landscape, the resources that this history, whether individual or collective, has had a national impact. It has changed the shape of the nation. And that is why you have a national park designation. What's truly dynamic about this history is that it's also connected to a global narrative. And so there's a lot of interest in connecting the story in West Africa, connecting the story and thinking about world heritage and things along those lines. In collaboration with our university partners, I mentioned our sister park, Colonial National Monument. There are so many others. We're working, as I mentioned, with descendant communities, and some of whom, like Calvin mentioned, are lineal descendants, but we are also working with communities who identify as free Black, as descendants of free Blacks, descendants of slaveholders, and Native American, to have conversations with one another, to develop programs with one another, to commemorate and collaborate with one another. And it is tedious work. It's not easy work. You have to deal with both your intellectual and emotional reactions to that process, but it's necessary work. And so when I think about how we're expanding our understanding, I think just this conversation in and of itself is evidence of that. We've come a long way in how we talk about the arrival of Africans in Virginia, how we think about that history in context to American history, American identity, and American ideals.
Thank you, Eola. Dr. Newby-Alexander.
Thank you. You know, when I think about some of the work that has gone on, I think about my own work. I did my dissertation looking at the emerging African-American community in the city of Norfolk. But of course, I had to talk about Fort Monroe because so many people actually fled from Norfolk to Fort Monroe at the beginning of the Civil War and then returned. And there was quite a bit of cross-pollination between those two areas. And so I really got to know a lot of the story, the contraband story. And I delved deeper into learning a little bit more about Mary Kelsey Peak, who was the first the first teacher hired by the American Missionary Association. She was already teaching people in Hampton, originally born in Norfolk, and taught people while she was in Norfolk. And then her family moved to Hampton and she began to teach them, which she was the first one hired to teach the people designated as contrabands of war. And so I began to go backward in time and looking more at the Revolutionary period and even before then. And when I started to look at 1619 and I started to read the materials that were there, and I began to pull together, I would say, a different understanding, because I call these first Africans unfree. I call them neither enslaved. I certainly don't call them indentured servants because they did not sign a contract. They were captured with a war that was intended to get enslaved people and force them into slavery and force them across the Atlantic Ocean. But I call them unfree, and I began to look at the laws and so forth, and I started to write presentations, and I was invited to talk at a number of conferences and special programs, especially for teachers all throughout Virginia, North Carolina, West Virginia, and even into some of the other states throughout the United States. And I started then writing articles about it. And one of the articles was recently published in a book called Engaging K through 12 in the African Diaspora, because I thought it was very, very important that teachers begin to understand this history and that they would have documentation to provide them with an understanding of how to teach this material, not from the textbook perspective. Calvin talked about some of the myths and the wrong information in those textbooks, or in our understanding, quote unquote, of 1619. I felt it was really important for teachers to have this material in their hands. And so I have invested a lot of time and energy into writing op-ed pieces and talking to newspaper reporters and television reporters to try to get this information out and to make sure that it is accurate, as opposed to perpetuating some of the myths that I still see circulating in a lot of newspapers and in a lot of textbooks. My goal, my hope, is that eventually we will begin to change the national and international narrative about 1619, and I believe that we are on the course to do just that.
Thank you so much. Calvin.
Oh, I hadn't unmuted, had I? Oh, I'm up. Let me just talk to you about the goal of Project 1619. And our goal has always been to educate people about Africa and the history of the first Africans, who we were, where we came from, how we were treated. And I think we've done a great job of that in changing the narrative from Jamestown to Point Comfort, present-day Fort Monroe. We have been able to educate scholars around the country and around the world. And I do a lot of speaking engagements, and I'm surprised that when I go out to speak in certain locations that people still do not know the history. For an example, I spoke in the Richmond area, Chesterfield County, Henrico area, and after my presentation, I had all these young students came up to me and said, our history books still tell us the Jamestown story. And our teachers won't tell us about Point Comfort. And so right now we have a problem with our Board of Education in Virginia trying to come up with a correct history book to tell our story and not the story that's been told for the past 100 years or so. So when we look at the promise of the perfect union, we stated, and I just recently wrote an article that says the perfect union is still a fleeting star on the horizon. Some days it shines bright with promise, but on most days it's shrouded in the sin of America, slavery. Just imagine, 155 years ago, slavery was abolished. Only 56 years ago, Congress decided it was time to give people of color their civil rights, and a year later, their right to vote. So to say we are all created equal with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is still an illusion to those disenfranchised people of color. The history of 1619 has taught us that change is gradual. But the late John Lewis said, we do not want gradual change, we want it now. I think that we are seeing now that in the social injustice, we're seeing now that social injustice was prevalent in the dark. But now with cell phones, we're finding out that those injustices are now being brought to the light in our fight for civil rights and equality for all people. So I think we're headed in the right direction. What we've seen transpired here in America and around the world in the past 3 or 4 months is a new direction, a new quest to treat people fairly, equally, as when we look at civil rights. So I think we're headed in the right direction.
Thank you, Calvin. Glenn, same question.
Yeah, I'll go very quickly and just simply say that as I read the part about expanding our understanding of the African landing, I go back to the statement of power of place. Terry Brown, when he took over as the superintendent and he and I would walk around the property, one day he just stopped and he said, I got to tell you, Glenn, there's footsteps. There's footsteps all over this property that we can't see. He said, we've got to give those footsteps, we got to bring them to life, and we have to give them a voice. I mean, how exciting to think about that, and how challenging at the same time. So, you know, at Fort Monroe, we've added interpretive signs that weren't up here before that help tell the story. We're finding a better way to tell the story. You know, we've taken down the letters. I mean, in the 1950s, the Daughters of the Confederacy, working with the Army, put up a memorial arch to Jefferson Davis, who was a Secretary of War when the fort was being built, and senator and imprisoned there. We've taken that down, and we're interpreting that very differently right now because we want Fort Monroe to be a more inclusive site and a place where you can understand why was an arch like that built and what was happening then. We have walking tours now that are going to be starting up, and that will be self-guided walking tours because of COVID, but we've expanded the self-guided walking tours at Fort Monroe with a complete brochure so that the whole property comes to life, much like Terry Brown's vision was. And we've just completed a $9 million visitor center. Now, don't get excited. It's not, you know, it's not like the Smithsonian. I mean, there's not, you know, floors and floors of interpretation. But there's interpretation in that visitor center that has never been talked about in Fort Monroe before. I mean, the Indians who were here first and how they lived on the land, the impact of the culture when the African culture was brought here, and some of the things that Calvin's talked about. So, and I would close by saying we've done all this with partnerships. That's the thing. I think if our country could come to the understanding that we are stronger when we unite and we bring our collective thoughts and our energy and our passions together, and you work with groups like Project 1619, you can add your assets to that, and suddenly you become with a more dynamic and more collaborative story.
Thank you, Glenn. The final question for the panel for our programming purposes, we're having our participants drop questions into the chat. But the final question that we have is, as we approach the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution and communities wrestle with the issues of justice and equity, how does the history of 1619 and your efforts to document and share this history inform research and engagement efforts ahead? And we will start with you, Glenn.
And again, I want to get to other people's questions, but I will tell you that we have a gigantic aspirational goal at Fort Monroe as we look to the future. And our gigantic aspirational goal is, if we could capture this, what I've described as this power of place, if we could capture that, what if Fort Monroe became a place where people from across the country came here almost as a pilgrimage to feel this power of place and to see where this began at Point Comfort? What if people came here and felt those footsteps underneath them? What if they heard those voices? What if that story came to life? What if scholars came here to be embraced and absorbed into this environment? What if Fort Monroe could become the National Center for Freedom in our country? A place where scholars and people of all ages and all ethnicities would come to Fort Monroe to feel this power of place and to start or complete or contribute to their personal journey. Another thing we're doing as we look to the future is we are working on what we call the African Landing Memorial Art Project. And we've hired an artist out of Florida after doing a national search. We're working with groups like Project 1619 and the Commonwealth of Virginia is helping fund it, the Fort Monroe Foundation. And we are on the cusp, I would say in the next several months, of actually beginning to re-engage with the public to show them what the concept would be for an African Landing Memorial Art Project at Fort Monroe. And it's a much bigger project than just a memorial. It's also going to be a place. What if it becomes a park-like setting? What if it's a green space, but it's also a park where people can come and there can be ceremonies and there could be commemorations that take place there. So the National Center for Freedom and our African Landing Memorial Art Project. And I'll close by saying, again, we have big goals at Fort Monroe. We dream big. What if this African Landing Memorial Art Project, this memorial project, could have the same impact on race relations in our country that the Vietnam Memorial had on how we felt about the Vietnam War?
Thank you, Glenn. Great. Eola, you're up.
Thank you. Wow, just building on what Glenn has shared, particularly as cooperative manager here at Fort Monroe, and thinking about the 250th, I think it is absolutely a critical time to have the difficult conversations about race, identity, justice, and equality. And the Freedom Center that Glenn has mentioned is a space and place where that can happen. Also in our interpretation and our engagement efforts, we can continue to do that. That could be through dialogue, through special history studies, new exhibits. It's hard work, but I think with this group and with our broader community of partners, we're up to the challenge and we have a responsibility to do it. Part of that work has to do with relevancy and of course inclusion. And so beyond talking about the history, the National Park Service has made efforts since the 1970s to increase employment of African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, and other underrepresented communities. We're working to expand their stories as well. Those efforts are with great purpose and start with youth. And so one of the examples here at Fort Monroe is under the leadership of Ranger Aaron Firth. And we have a partnership with Hampton City, one of our sponsors for African Landing Day. And that partnership is called the Fort Monroe Stewardship Academy. And we have 9 students from Phoebus High School who are learning about MPS careers and key stories. We also work with organizations like Greening Youth Foundation and also the Urban Archaeology Corps. And so all of these programs are youth programs in the National Park Service that we hope will help us to attract and recruit and retain diverse employees that represent the diversity of the nation. And we think that's also critical in being able to tell these stories, is to have people who are connected to the stories involved in telling the stories.
That's super important to have the people, the descendant communities actually involved in telling the stories. I'm always so happy to hear that Park Service is doing that because it's important. Dr. Newby-Alexander.
Thank you. You know, in 2019, our governor of Virginia, Ralph Northam, created a special commission, and it was the Commission on African American History Education. It was something that a group of us who were part of the Center for African American Public Policy at Norfolk State University pushed forward to look at the standards of learning, because it was detrimentally impacting our young people throughout the Commonwealth. If you consider that 85% of the students who are in public schools in Virginia are African American, and yet very little African American history is incorporated into our national narrative. In fact, most of what Virginia teaches is part of that old master narrative that I spoke about before. Then teaching this history is really critical. And so one of the things that I was very thankful of is that the governor asked me to not only be a part of the commission, but to co-chair the commission. And I have been tasked with looking at the standards and talking about amending some of the standards immediately with edits, technical edits. And one of the first things that my subcommittee did, and I made sure we did, was to correct the narrative about 1619. And so this new edited standard is supposed to roll out in the fall. And we're hoping that when the standards are rewritten, and it's a 2-year process that begins this fall, that it will be much more robust and inclusive and accurate. And so I'm hopeful that within the next 5 years, we will have a very different perspective of how our young people are being taught, so that when people like Calvin goes to a public school, he will not be inundated. None of us will be inundated by teachers or students who do not know the history of Africans in America, and in particular in Virginia, but especially are unaware of this important history that began in 1619. And so my hope is, and it's not just an aspirational hope, it's a hope that's born in some of the work that so many people are committed to doing, is to change those standards so that we begin to be more robust, more inclusive, and of course, much more accurate when we talk about the history of our nation. Thank you.
Thank you. Calvin.
Well, thank you. That was a lively discussion, and we're running short on time. So instead of me repeating what was said, can I answer a question?
Absolutely.
Okay, let me go to Zakia. Zakia, thank you for your question. Her question is, why does it matter if Jamestown, why do we use Point Comfort instead of Jamestown? Is it important that we use Point Comfort? And one of the misconceptions that we try to tell people is that it was not the Jamestown colony. It was a Virginia colony. It was the Jamestown settlement. And as the colony grew, so did the number of settlements. Settlements like Point Comfort, Isle of Wight, Charles City. In July of 1619, there were so many settlements doing their own thing, having their own center of government, their own laws. And that was one of the primary reasons for the General Assembly meeting in July of 1619 as a legislative session to try to bring everybody under the rule of law. So it was important for us to distinguish that there were 8 separate shires, and the first ship landed at Point Comfort. And I'm pretty sure if that first ship had landed at Isle of Wight or Charles City, they would be in the same position that we are. They would want recognition that their site was the first landing of that first ship. So that's why it was important to Project 1619 to tell the true story, because you can only land one time. That is the first landing. The first ship bringing enslaved, we call them enslaved Africans. Some people call them they were held in bondage, whatever the phrase you want to use. But it was important to Project 1619 that we pinpoint the exact location where that ship landed. So that's why we switched the narrative from Jamestown to Point Comfort.
Thank you, Calvin. I think we are running short on time. If there are any other questions in the chat that we can't get to, I will send them to our panelists, and we will try to answer them through email. But I want to thank all of our panelists today, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, Calvin Pearson, Eola Dance, and Glenn. I really appreciate all of you. And as we're speaking about collaboration, thank you for collaborating with the Association of African American Museums on today's African Landing commemoration. We've been around for 42 years, and this is just something that we love to do. We love to collaborate with our partners and those who see value in AAAM as we see value in you. I think I'm supposed to pass it back on to Calvin, and Calvin will discuss what the importance is of the call for ancestors.
Each year during African Landing Day, we do a couple of ceremonies. One is a libation where we honor our ancestors and those who have passed. We talk about 17 million Africans who were captured on the east coast of Africa. We talk about 12.5 million Africans captured on the west coast of Africa. We talk about 1.5 million Africans who died on their journey from their homeland down to the slave ships. We talk about 1.5 million people who died going through the Middle Passage. So we do a variety of programs during African Landing Day, and we can't do libation in this setting. So what we want to do, we want to talk about flower petal ceremony. We do a flower petal ceremony where we throw flowers into the ocean to signify the millions of lives lost coming through the Middle Passage and those that died back in Africa. So what we want to do today, we're going to close this session of the program with a flower petal ceremony. Now, traditionally what we do is that we ask people to call out a name of their family relative. If you are a descendant of the first African families, if you can call out their names, whether it's the Tucker family, the Goins, the Driggers, the Blizzards, the Johnsons, the Sweats, the Cornish, the Dahl, the Carter, the Phillips. There's so many of the first family names that we have out there. So what we're going to do right now is that we're going to do a symbolic flower petal throwing. And we want you to, if you're by yourself or in a group, call out the names of those ancestors or those who have passed on. And if some of you want to, you can type in the name of those ancestors into the chat. So as I throw the flower petals, we call out their names.
Margaret and Leroy Smith.
Isabel and Anthony.
Nat Turner.
Harriet Tubman.
Truth.
Mary Peak.
And that's how we do our traditional flower petal ceremony. It's a little bit different at Fort Monroe because we have that great body of water where we can throw the flower petals and we can let them go out into the ocean, go out into the river, representing of the millions of lives lost. So thank you.
Thank you, Calvin. And with the calling of the last name in the chat, I see the last name just was dropped in. Thank you so much. And with that, our program has closed. It has come to an end. I thank all of you guys for coming and being with us today. You could have spent your Saturday any other way, but you spent it today with us, and we're so appreciative. We look forward to doing more events with you and seeing you soon.